by a loud series of creaking and cracking sounds, and I knew something large was the time I bolted indoors, and you can imagine the sleepless night I spent there, damn near pissing myself every time I heard an owl or the house creak. The smell of those fucking Bamacles had permeated the house. The smell alone, like sulfur, could have kept me up. The tapping from my room resonated into the living room, where I huddled on the floor like a paranoiac. Somehow the crane flies were getting in, and now and again one would land near me and I'd have to crush it. I remember hearing a sort of clicking sound and looking up to see my ceiling coated in the fucking things. As I looked at their black mass of bodies, the tapping seemed to register my pulse, getting louder and faster. I was sweating profusely, scared to look at the windows, trying to ignore the heat and the bugs and the tapping until it was too much, and switched on the television, an old set that still had rabbit ears and picked up barely the glitchiest signal, but at least it drowned out the tapping. The screen just showed static and the vaguest forms of what looked like an infomercial or something, but the sound quality was perfect when I heard, within seconds of switching it on, annual scholarship grant has been awarded to an anonymous, who will be doing field work up in Arnhem. Congratulations, Anon. The words just registered dimly and I couldn't be fucked anymore, so I just left the set on and the sound worked for a couple more names before giving out and giving way to a soft static, which I turned up to full volume. The tapping noted this and got louder, beating like a metronome. At this stage I was almost laughing. I felt a bit delirious and couldn't get a grasp on if this was really happening or not. Then a different sound beat down the corridor, a hard loud knock, at the front door. I waited in terrified stillness. There came another knock. And then a voice. "Hey Anon, you home?" The voice was familiar, my friends from the town. I'd forgotten they were coming over on the weekend. "Hey Anon, we're meant to be hanging out, remember?" But why was he over at 3 a.m? "Come on man, I can see you through the window." I looked up at the big windows, but I could see the dark night outside. Maybe I could see some big thing, my friend waving, or just trees brushing against each other, or bugs at the window. It was impossible to tell. The thought of letting another person in made me realize the state I was in, the number of bugs on the walls and the ceiling, and that god-awful smell. I shouted out that was going to let them in, just be a minute. No response. As I scaled the corridor I noted I couldn't hear the tapping anymore. I flicked on the outdoor light but couldn't make out a thing through the dappled glass window on the door. I took the handle and cranked open the big front door, then looked out onto an empty deck and the barren front section. I called out if he was out there or not. Then, from behind me hear the reply, "The other door, Anon." What the fuck, I think. I definitely heard him calling out from the front. But at this stage I can't be sure in my own senses, so I just call out that he shouldn't be a lazy cunt and should just come around the front. A long pause, as I stand at the open door, then, "Come on Anon, don't be a lazy cunt, come around and open the door." At this stage I feel barely awake, hardly registering my steps as I move back down the corridor. As I near the side of the house where I scraped off all the barnacles, the rank smell increases steadily and I approach the back door, and look through the window to see if there's anyone there. For a moment I see nothing, just the bare swamp on all sides. Then I turn to look onto the side of the door and see looking back at me a face so fucking horrible I don't like to even think of it today. The only thing I can compare it to is pick related. I fucking scream and fall back, and it fucking bolts it. The shock left me dizzy and thought I would vomit. The smell reeling together whatever sanity I had left, I knew I had to board up the windows, lock the door and wear out the night. As I regained my senses I had to hold onto the wall, grab onto things to pull myself up onto two legs. Once I did I was still wobbling on my ankles, like seasickness, when I heard the unmistakable scatter of pots across the kitchen floor. I turned and realized I'd left the front door wide open. And the heaviness of the heat in the air seems to sink into my pores and I'm weighed into the corner against the back door. The chills that ran down my body were palpable. I couldn't have made a sound if I wanted to. I was entirely fixed on stilling myself and listening with an almost morphine clarity, the adrenaline I guess. Then again, the clash of disturbed cutlery, and a slow wheeze like a choked inhale, ha. When it was silent and still I could barely contain body shivers. My mind wasn't processing a thing but for any noise from the kitchen. I registered the cold impression of the door handle in my palm, but I wouldn't dare turn it if it creaked. Then, a soft crunch, like of skin pressing on the floor. I saw something white breaching into the corridor, and again the low wheeze. Leisurely the small round eyes swiveled around and looked right at me. Ha! I fucking bolted it through the door, a flash of white through the windows, running for the open door. I burst forward blindly and ran, not knowing which direction or where. I couldn't afford to care that I was heading straight into the swamp. The idea of turning back for the car, of going around the house was, once I'd started running, a debunked option. It didn't even occur to me. The feeling of mud permeating and squelching in your shoes and the knowledge of it caking there, making every step painfully loud. More than once my foot caught a tough root and I fell ass over tit, but again I just couldn't afford to recognize it and just got back up every time. There was no visibility even by the time my eyes should have adjusted to the light, any moonlight was totally obscured by the overcrowded canopy. As I ran there were no sounds, but by the time my body had run past its limit and I was drunkenly heaving through the trees, sweating, I heard a lot of bug noise on the water and occasionally snippets of bird wings shaking off nearby, and weird croaks. Frantically I tried to pick out that awful wheeze but couldn't focus on this for any extended period, because doing so seemed to make the experience into a practical reality, instead of a fever dream, as I could only bring myself to process it as, even moving at speed, was a sweated out mess, borderline unconscious and soaked in mud. There was no sign by which to gauge where I was, only the huge figures of the trees around and the lumpen masses of the swamp. My knees started slipping under me and I heard a splash that silenced all the bugs as I slumped into the water, my entire body succumbing to that pins and needles numbness all at once. Face half buried under the water line, I only jerked my head up with difficulty, and the brackish water smelled richly off that sulfurous reek. For a long time I lay there, in a small pool to myself, my skin sensing nothing around it. Gradually the bug noise returned on the water surface, and it seemed like I could hear the distinct clicks and water plops of each one. Nothing of the light nor sound changed. If there was a moon, it was lost under layers on layers of branches and clouds. It was impossible to tell how much time had passed. I couldn't even guess how long it had been till this weird noise emerged, slowly, from somewhere to the east of me. Immediately I knew it was no animal or forest sound because it was the sound of television static. The bug life went quiet and even the sound of the water and the canopy seemed to die out as this thick white noise spread out and neared. It took all my strength to muster just one arm. There was now the quiet splish splosh of feet in the water, growing louder. Outstretching the arm, it felt like every sinew in my shoulder would snap. My fingers gripped the first thing they found and I sensed my body being pulled forward. Somehow, mud-covered, shivering like all hell, and every joint burning, I slumped into the upturned husk of a log and, out of the bare scraps of energy left in me, pulled myself fully into the dark tube. This muffled the dim splish splash of footfall. There I sort of fell limp like a rag doll, unable to exert any more. Somewhere nearby heard a faint, ha. Now I couldn't control my breathing or stillness. I could see nothing but for a crescent slither of the log opening near my feet. The inside of the log was very cold and clingy, but my discomfort meant nothing as I strained out onto the little crescent slit of visibility. For a moment it was blotted out by something big and white. The sound of static was overwhelming, as if a television had been dumped in the bog. But then the thing was gone, and in time the noise faded. And in time the bug noise picked back up. I don't know when I passed out. My clothes were wrapped on my bones and had dried there. This was the same for the mud in my shoes. For a moment I thought I was paralyzed, then an inch of crushed log under me gave way. and I realized was I half fossilized into the shit. My eyes were so encrusted with dirt and gunk that at first they wouldn't open, and there was a dull stinging as I peeled my eyelashes apart and the full light of the sun burned through, overwhelming my senses. It took me a little while to realize I was awake, and where I was. The compost odor of the log's interior and the brushing sense of things moving around under me and certain wet objects winding slowly through my hair alerted me to that. The feeling of worms feeling across my scalp, curling at the roots of hairs should have made me want to carve all my hair out, but there was no way to think about this which made sense to me anymore. I wanted only to pull myself out of the husk and back to the house. I knew I had to pack my things and not return. There was no recovering from this. Yet at some level I knew how truly lost I was, already, and how hot the day was and how parched my throat and mouth were. My retinas were burned ragged with heat and too little sleep. As I lifted myself up, bending my knees and dragging my body out bottom first, I noticed something different under my arm, a distinct lack of feeling in my armpit. As I peeled myself out into the shallow pool of last night, shedding spiders and worms falling out of my hair, I examined myself. There were a lot of cuts on the arm, when the mud was scratched off. But then I lifted the arm up and this time there could be no calm, and I screamed aloud, again and again and again when I saw the whole of my armpit overfilled with a great hardened cluster of barnacles. I screamed so much I was dry heaving, and fell onto my knees in the water. In a moment of panicked distraction, I forced myself to notice how the pool reflected the blue of the sky exactly. Without the blackened trees the scene would appear like two intersecting planes of sky and glass. But the feeling of all those thousands of little shells forming piles in my pit and the little islands of them that filed down my arm and in the dips of my ribs. Concentrating myself, improvising a gross curiosity, I took my hand to the rock-like outer surface of the man lump and gritted my teeth as my nails scraped down, catching on some gaps and then prying as hard as I fucking could. There was a loud crunch and a lightning bolt of pain struck my side, causing me to reel over once more. A crack had appeared in the lump, under which was the pinky end of the inner goop. But I couldn't shake the awful source of that pain, the feeling of their thin little roots pulling and popping in my skin. Finally I vomited. The numbness of it was now overcome by a hyper-awareness of all the little roots spread out in my meat. It took my all just to push past the sensation to find a rock. With the rock firmly in hand and sweating hard, I brought it down once, twice, and again on the mass. Each time it cracked and popped, but the pain worsened and the throbbing horrible awareness of all those roots only increased, like they were clinging harder in there. Somewhere through the trees. The smell of smoke, and I'm moving towards it full speed, delirious. There's the whisper of a crackling fire and all I can do is follow, desperately. The emerald light of flames burned through the air and the rich smell was so reassuring that for a moment I forgot about the horrible things in my body. I stumbled out of the conifers into a small clearing, which looked like a drained patch of bog, where could be seen a crude sort of timber hut, looking hastily assembled from a few small trunks, offering little cover. The fire was burning only a few meters off, unshielded, from a pile of dry twigs and leaves, with no regard to the hut. Then my eyes were drawn to the outer rim of the clearing, marking its boundaries against the water, where had been erected several sharpened pikes, each domed with the black faces of rotting animals. They mostly seemed to be the degree to which most had rotted away. The sight of these things, intermittently swamped by the smoke, was something to behold.